Hello, welcome to the New Monarchies. Going to go through this and hopefully get through this fairly quickly. So, for the first half of the 15th century, the states continued to lose power, and so many of these large states were losing power and were fragmenting. In the second half, signs of recovery were evident, and a few Western European states were able to centralize power in what has been termed the New Monarchies, quote unquote. France, England, Spain are going to be your three major players in this. Eastern European states were unable to really centralize power into one government. So, three trends, as you can see. The movement from decentralized power and authority to centralization, as we just mentioned. Movement from the political elite, consisting primarily of a hereditary landed nobility, toward one open to men, distinguished by their education, skills, and wealth. And then the movement from religious toward secular norms of law, as we talked about with humanism and everything. But what they do, they consolidated power and created the foundation for Europe's first modern nation states, and again, France, England, and Spain. This evolution had begun in the Middle Ages. Monarchies had grown weaker in Eastern Europe during the Middle Ages. So these new monarchies never really achieved absolute power. And we're going to get to absolutism, and it didn't really emerge until 17th century with Louis XIV. New monarchies are also not nation states in the modern sense that we think of it. Populations did not necessarily feel that they belonged to a quote-unquote nation. So identity, it was more local or regional. Modern notion of nationalism isn't even going to emerge until even much later than that in the 18th and early 19th centuries. So what characteristics do they have? They reduced the power of the nobility. The taxation by taxing and then confiscation of lands, particularly from uncooperative nobles. They did hire mercenary armies. The creation of a standing army is also going to help them. The advent of gunpowder resulted in the production of muskets and cannon, increased the vulnerability of these noble armies and their knights. The nobles who supported the kings gained titles and offices and served in the royal court or as a royal type of royal officials. How did they reduce the political power of the clergy? The medieval notion of the church being supreme to the state was going to be replaced in belief and practice. It did create more efficient bureaucracies and enabled the new monarchs to begin centralizing control of their realms. The bourgeoisie, again, this is at the expense of the nobility. A lot of times they start to increase their power, and it's going to be at the expense of nobility. They brought in revenues to the crown, more in France than really in Spain. And it did increase the public or the national debt as well. So opposition, who were the major opponents? Well, the nobles, obviously, because the bourgeoisie have just replaced them. The clergy, because when you start to replace the power of the church, you're going to notice people are going to, obviously, the Pope isn't going to be considered the leader, and people are going to be upset about that. And these independent towns are going to start to resist too, because they didn't want the centralized monarchical control. So France, and this is Louis. So we have Charles VII and then Louis XI, the Spider King. France population decline, economic turmoil, and made it hard to assert power for French kings. But the 100 Years' War, as we just learned about, was a rallying point for nationalism and placed power in the hands of the king. Charles VII was able to convince the Estates General to grant him this power to levy taxes, and that's the tie right there, which was a direct tax. This gave the monarch power over Parliament. Political and economic recovery, again, did begin after the 100 Years' War. England had been expelled from France, as we already know, and we'll see on the next slide, I think is where I'll show you where the defeat of the Duchy of Burgundy removed the threat of the new state within the eastern part of France. So then you have the Spider King. And he continued this and was able to raise significant money and add to his coffers. The nobility, of course, had other ideas, particularly Charles the Bold, who was Duke of Burgundy. He tried to create what was called a middle kingdom. Charles is going to be killed in a war, and Louis at this point is going to sweep in, and he's going to add the Duchy of Burgundy to his own land. This created a base for later developments of a strong French monarchy. What else did he do? Again, created a large royal army, dealt ruthlessly with nobles, individually and within the Estates General, did increase taxes, exerted power over the clergy, actively encouraged economic growth, promoted new industries, did a lot, encouraged these foreign merchants and craftsmen really to immigrate to France, and entered into some commercial treaties with England and the Hanseatic League that we already talked about as well. And here's just the map to show you of what happened with Charles the Bold and how the Spider King was able to seal, Picardy and Burgundy upon the death. He was called the Spider King because his wheeling and dealing within the political system, his ability to effectively use politics for his power, was one of his trademarks. So England, War of the Roses, 1485. 100 Years' War, again touching on that, left England without money and manpower. The War of the Roses, add the above to the civil, like the 100 Years' War to the civil unrest, and you end up with civil wars, right? The Ducal House of Lancaster fought the Ducal House of York, which pitted a number of aristocratic families against one another. And in 1485, Henry Tudor, Duke of Richmond, defeated the last Yorkist king, Richard III, and established the Tudor dynasty. Henry VII was a strong and wise leader who avoided war. And when you do that, you think, well, doesn't that make him weak? No, it makes him wealthy because war costs a lot of money. He got rid of internal dissension by getting rid of the idea that livery and maintenance, which was the practice of aristocrats that would keep their private armies, and he's going to get rid of it. This rid them of a fighting force. He also created the Court of the Star Chamber, which dealt with aristocratic threats. No juries, they did allow torture, and it certainly reduced the influence of the nobility because nobles would be tried without a jury and could not confront witnesses, and torture obviously was an effective tool. A real strong suit of Henry's, as mentioned, was his ability to raise money without it making everyone mad. He was clever with his taxes. No one really felt overburdened, and this provided some support from the middle class. Spain, and we'll talk more about this one, particularly in classes, because these two are going to have leave their mark on European history in so many ways. Spain had been several independent kingdoms. Unification was, again, we call it unification, but as you'll see, we'll talk a little bit more about it. The marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469, and we're going to see a map on the next page to show you just what this unification was. This was a dynastic union of two rulers. This was not a political union. Each kingdom, Castile and Aragon, really did get to maintain their own parliaments, their courts, their laws, but they worked to strengthen the royal control of government. They did get rid of aristocratic power by filling jobs with some middle-class lawyers who were loyal to them. They did have a royal army. The feudal armies were disbanded. They reorganized the military forces of Spain, and the development of a strong infantry made the Spanish army really the best in Europe at this point. They really required and worked hard, particularly Ferdinand Isabella, with the idea of religious uniformity. And a genius power grab, thanks to power and the money, they convinced the Catholic Church to grant them the power to select the most important church officials in Spain. The clergy at this point, because they're selecting them, is essentially becoming an extension of this royal power. The church reforms removed immorality in the ranks, or said to. The Inquisition. Jews and Muslims were two sizable religious minorities, which had been tolerated. While tolerated, some Jews obviously were persecuted and forced to convert to Christianity. There were whispers that many converted Jews were reverting back to Judaism, and this angered Ferdinand and Isabella, and they asked the Pope to introduce the Inquisition in 1478. This was under royal control and worked efficiently, but it was very, very cruel. The conquest of Granada. The war against the last Muslim kingdom in Spain lasted 11 years, and really until 1492. Muslims could convert, but by 1502, Isabella issued a decree expelling all professed Muslims from her kingdom. In 1492, again going backwards, they had conquered Muslim Granada and decided to keep going. They began expelling Jews, and some 150,000, like 200,000 Jews had fled. The expulsion of Jews and Muslims led to absolute religious orthodoxy. Spain was inherently Catholic and was a crown jewel of Catholicism during the Reformation. As you can see here, just how big of a land it was that united this. Again, remember, this is a political, or not a political unification. Again, they were able to hold their own courts, their laws and such, but as you can see, it's a good chunk of the Iberian Peninsula. And here's Europe in the second half of the 15th century. You can kind of see some of the divisions and how it looks. So Central, Eastern, and the Ottoman empires. The Habsburg Empire, Holy Roman Empire, consisted of about 300 semi-autonomous German states. Each state had its own foreign policy. Wars sometimes occurred between these states. And the center of Habsburg power was in Austria and other hereditary states nearby. The Holy Roman Empire was not a new monarchy. Do not get it confused. Not a new monarchy. The emperor did not have centralized control, could not levy taxes or raise armies outside of his own, what they called hereditary lands. And again, largely around Austria. Habsburg kings were never able to gain control of the numerous German states, the duchies, or the principalities within the Holy Roman Empire. Maximilian I was a considerable ruler. He gained much territory in eastern France with his marriage to Mary of Burgundy. This started this dynastic struggle between the French Valois dynasty and the Habsburgs, which would last all the way until almost 1560. Charles V, again, also important, most powerful ruler in Europe in the 16th century, and we're going to talk more about him. But he controlled Austrian Habsburg lands while he ruled Spanish Empire, really at the height of its power. Armies sacked Rome in 1527. This symbolically kind of ended the Renaissance in Italy. And then you get the Habsburg-Valois Wars. Holy Roman Empire was locked in a dynastic struggle with Francis I for control of Burgundian territories in Italy. Charles V sought to prevent the spread of the Protestant Reformation in Germany through his reign. Again, what happens with Poland, the struggle for the strong monarchy in Europe, or Eastern Europe, is they were unable to centralize power due to many of these cleavages within society, these different things. These included religious. You had Roman Catholic, you had Greek Orthodox, you also had pagans. Then you had ethnic ones as well, even though a lot were mostly Slavic. Poland, not unique in Europe. Many of the problems were rooted in the struggle for power between the landed nobles, as we already talked about, and the crown. The rulers had focused on problems in Bohemia and war, which distracted them. The aristocrats were able to reestablish power through their control of the Sejm. S-E-J-M is the word, it's the Sejm. It's their legislature. Those in power weakened peasants so much that Poland reverted back to serfdom by 1511. Hungary was Roman Catholic and tied to the church. With the help and wealth of Hungary, turned into an important state. Some success with King Matthias Corvinus, but Hungary returned to weak rule after him. So good rulers could come and go, but a lot of times their power would go away as well. Corvinus was a typical Renaissance prince, and he was patron of the arts, had a brilliant court. Russia, from the 13th century, Russia was dominated by the Mughals, but princes in Moscow gained power as they were close to the Khan. As the princes gained power, they pushed for more and more. Ivan III created the Principality of Moscow, and he began to annex more land. Russian land was expanded when Ivan III took advantage of some dissension among the Mongols in 1480. The Ottoman Turks in the Byzantine Empire. The Seljuk Turks spread into Byzantine territory. The Byzantine Empire had served as a buffer between the Ottomans and the Europeans for centuries. Beginning in the 13th century, Ottomans were seizing land, and by 1345 they had bypassed Constantinople and moved into the Balkans. Under Sultan Mehmed Ottoman, forces moved through Bulgaria into the land of the Serbs. In 1389, the Battle of Kosovo, both of the leaders are going to perish, and it took until about 1480 for Bosnia, Albania, and Serbia to be added to the Ottoman Empire. Constantinople fell to the Turks in 1453. The Ottomans completed the demise of the Byzantine Empire when Sultan Mehmed II had 80,000 troops against a paltry 7,000 defenders. War raged, and the firepower of the Ottomans was too much to repel. After the fall of Constantinople, the Ottomans tried to complete their conquest of the Balkans. They reached a bit of a stalemate, and didn't try to expand for a while. Beginning in the 16th century, the Ottomans would renew their offensive. And here you can see is just a map of what that looks like, and how you can see the Ottoman Empire and what they were trying to accomplish. And we will again talk more about this in class.